police detective. Peter, afternoon to you. I know as a former cop, you're probably going to say, these were the worst cases that any police officer could come across and deal with. And I guess police officers probably have that same sense of injustice when they realise that someone who's been responsible for the death of a child, murder, manslaughter, whatever, a court decides, and then receives a sentence that just seems so woefully inadequate. I guess you share that same incredulity.
Well, yes, they do, generally speaking, but they keep those thoughts private because as a detective, you are going to come across many, many cases where you will feel that the sentencing is woefully inadequate. But, of course, sentencing people is a matter for the judiciary and not the police.
True.
If the detectives have done their job, gathered the evidence, presented that to the Crown Prosecution Service, that then present the case at court and somebody gets convicted, pragmatic detectives will often shrug their shoulders, say nothing in public, behave with all discretion possible, and then perhaps privately express their dismay. I, of course, have long since left the police, but have the freedom and fortunately the opportunity like today to sometimes represent the voices of police officers that I know who can't speak publicly, or those who express their views anonymously on social media. And of course, together with many, many friends, we are completely aghast at the fact that Colin Pitchfork could ever be released. That is just truly astonishing and the poorest reflection possible on the parole board, who have clearly displayed just how out of touch they are. And before I finish this line on Pitchfork, can we all please remember the people that really, really count in this? Because it's not that psychopathic piece of garbage that's now on our streets. It's Dawn Ashworth and Linda Mann, the children, the victims. Yeah. Bless their souls.
Indeed. And I think we would all absolutely endorse those words, Peter. The cases that we're looking at here as well, two more recent cases, somebody who left their child at home to starve to death over 6 years and ends up with a 9-year prison sentence. I don't think that was a minimum sentence either handed out. I think that was 9 years, so that person out in 4.5 years. They're only in their 20s. Their life can continue as it did before.
Yes, and of course, in both these other cases that you've been discussing today, the people concerned were convicted of manslaughter and not murder. And of course, the sentencing guidelines that would have to be applied by the judge when handing down the sentence could be fairly restrictive. They have to take into account a number of matters like aggravating factors, and certainly with poor young Asiah, who was only 20 months old, whose mother disappeared off partying for days, there's very, very aggravating circumstances. But the judges do have to take into account the age of the perpetrator and any mitigation that they may have, although I struggle to think of
I'm sure, yes, but I'm sure there was somebody advancing those mitigating circumstances. It's interesting, isn't it, that, as you rightly say, Peter, it's that distinction between manslaughter and murder, and if it's not proved that you set out to end somebody's life, then it's never going to be a murder charge. And in these cases, unanimously, the juries obviously had to dismiss the notion of a murder charge in favour of manslaughter. It brings us then perhaps to another aspect of this as to whether there should be almost a different kind of charge introduced for child killers.
Well, in fact, the Domestic Violence Crime and Victims Act of 2004 changed what then was an appalling situation, because on a number of occasions, when a child or a baby was found dead and there were two suspected perpetrators, there was almost a loophole in the law that enabled them to blame one another.
Yeah.
It wasn't me, it was him, or it was her. And many people evaded justice until that act got passed. And that went some considerable way to changing what was very, very frustrating and unsatisfactory circumstances for detectives and, of course, for the victims, because they received no justice. If we look at the case of poor Kaylee Jade, which you've discussed today, not only did she have the injuries that proved fatal, but there was, of course, evidence of previous older injuries. So that may have gone some way towards persuading the judge that the sentence of 15 and 14 years that you handed down were of course more severe than the other case we heard about. Personally, this is just my personal view. I find it very, very concerning that both these women could complete their sentences and give birth again.
Yeah.
Now, of course, I'm not a radical, and I'm not in favour of any abominable thing like sterilisation or something like that. But clearly, there must be very robust systems put in place. So if they come out of prison, when they come out of prison, these two women and the man, of course, and they are able to give birth, or in his case, father a child again, the system needs to be all over this, because we simply
But we know it won't be, though, Peter, don't we?
history.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that one of the most common responses we're getting from listeners on this is that issue about, at the very least, some sort of sterilisation so these people can't go on to have children in the future. The smart money says this will just repeat itself, if not. You've sat down and interviewed people who've carried out horrendous crimes. I mean, I know there's not one type. There's lots of different types of people who do monstrous and evil things. But what did you make of it when you look into the eyes of somebody who's guilty of a terrible crime such as this?
At the time, I was so preoccupied with doing my job, which was finding the evidence. That's the driver. If you actually stop and think about the perpetrator or the victim for too long, that may cloud your thoughts and get in the way of conducting a 100% professional investigation. You almost have to detach yourself somewhat. Yeah. And it is perhaps only since I've left the police and had time to reflect on some of the ghastly people that sat in front of me in an interview room that I've thought, number one, kind of, how did I manage to maintain my cool? And of course, we are so fortunate the detectives, the length and breadth of the country, do just that.
Yeah. Peter, thank you. As ever, Peter Blexley, former Met Police detective.